Before the gods existed, the Eternum was a divine spark of creation itself. It was discovered by the Nephilim maiden, Andari, and with its power, she became a goddess. She ruled the lands of Eotha for a millennia, and the people prospered. No one knows from what foul corner of creation the Dark Stranger came. Driven by an ancient evil, he stole the Eternum and used its power to free his master from the void. Astaroth, Lord of Flame and Ruin. Together, they waged war on Eotha, and the land burned. When all hope seemed lost, the mage Elandriel forged a blade from the shards of Aristei, which had the power to call forth the heroes that had wielded it across the ages. A paladin who could rain down holy fire upon his foes. A druid priestess who commanded the power of both forest and beast. A dwarven thunderlord from his halls of stone. An elven blade master from the northern Sunderlands. And this is where your story begins.
Ryan Thomas with EastWest here, and welcome to the official walkthrough for Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra strings. And I cannot overstate how excited I am for this library. I've written for a lot of fantasy productions in the past, both animated and epic live-action fantasy. And of course, I grew up with the Lord of the Rings films as well as the Chronicles of Narnia films. So this genre is very close to my heart. And to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't think that it was possible to bring anything truly revolutionary to this space. But then I got a hold of Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra strings, and I was really just blown away. I think it captures the absolute best of the modern fantasy musical aesthetic, while also bringing something entirely new to it. So some of the inspirations for this library were soundtracks for The Witcher, God of War, Vikings, of course, Lord of the Rings, and so many others. But again, it's also bringing so many fresh concepts to the genre as well. So this walkthrough is going to be just a bit different. We're going to, of course, explore each instrument individually, but then we're going to break down the soundtrack that you heard at the beginning of this video and show you how Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra strings made it happen. So let's go ahead and get to the fun stuff. And the structure of the library is very straightforward. You've got all the instruments in this column to the left, and then their articulations are going to show up in these columns to the right. Now, the Quick Start folder basically contains the essential articulations that represent the best of each instrument. So let's go ahead and load up this key switch patch. And the library view is just going to contain the artwork for the instrument. The articulations view is going to show you which articulation is active. And you can also go over into the articulations matrix if you want to customize the key switch. You can actually change the key switch note. You can change the key switch parameter altogether, and you can also disable the articulation if you're not going to use it and you want to save the RAM. Then in the mic position view, you can actually see where the instruments were situated when they were being recorded. And you can also see where the mics were, so that'll kind of give you a visual guide that will be helpful when you are wanting to fine-tune your mic mix. So let's go ahead and start exploring the instruments, and we'll begin our journey with the Hardanger Fiddle, which was very famously featured in the solo from the Rohan theme in Lord of the Rings. It's got a very pure, very focused sound. And we're going to start in the legato patch. And of course, all of the legatos in this library are true legato. Now, one of the more unique features of this library is that instruments that are often recorded as solo instruments were actually recorded in small ensembles. So you get this beautiful presence in the mix, but you still have the intimacy of a solo instrument, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. The only instruments that were actually recorded individually were the two Hurdy Gurdies. So let's check out some of the shorts in the Hardanger Fiddles, and these have a really wonderful bite to them. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the Viola da Gamba. And this is just such a beautiful sonorous instrument. It's kind of the fantasy cousin of the cello. So it's got this kind of somber and stoic quality to it, but it's still very rich and lush. So we're going to start off in the legato patch. So here is the Viola da Gamba. Those just have such a unique color. It's almost otherworldly. So let's check out some of the short articulations. And these spiccatos that you're about to hear have this really cool jagged quality that I think makes them ideal for darker fantasy like The Witcher or Vikings. And then these are the collegnos. And much like with these spiccatos, I think these have this really cool jagged quality to them. So much like the other Hollywood series of instruments, Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra instruments also feature moods, which are just so useful. And moods are going to affect the internal reverb impulse response, the MIDI CC response curves, the mic mix, and the consordino control in the strings patches specifically. So they're just a really quick way to dial in the sound that you want without having to spend a lot of time messing with instrument controls. So here are the Viola da Gambas in the classic mood for reference. Here they are in the epic mood. And then here they are in the soft mood. All right, next, let's check out the lutes. And it really is difficult to express how much I love this instrument. So because these were recorded as an ensemble, you get this incredible, loose, kind of jangly character that absolutely captures the modern fantasy vibe. So here are the lutes. Now, one of my absolute favorite articulations in the entire library is the tremolo, both in the lutes as well as the dulcimers. They have such an incredible color. They add so much texture to a passage, and you are going to hear them all over my music from here on out. So here are the lute tremolos, and I'm just going to play these over a simple bass note. All right, now let's check out the mountain dulcimers. And these are going to give you a similar vibe to the lutes. You've got those nice pronounced transients at the beginning of each note. But of course, there are some differences in how the body is constructed and how the strings are played. So they're going to sound a little bit brighter than the lutes. And again, because these were recorded in an ensemble, you get this beautiful stereo field and presence, and they just really melt into the mix. So that's such an iconic sound. But again, the way that it was recorded, I think, is bringing something so fresh and innovative to it. So let's check out some of the other articulations, and we'll start off with these really cool double hits. And these are the triple hits. And then you have this really useful tempo-synced measured tremolo that's a really cool way to add some movement and texture to a passage. So both the lutes and the dulcimers are going to be ideal for adding really interesting texture and movement to a soundtrack. Of course, the lute is going to be a little bit more mellow, whereas the dulcimer is going to be brighter. But I think that they both function in roughly the same way, and they actually sound really beautiful when used together. So next, let's check out the Hurdy Gurdy. And we actually sampled two of these for this library. We're going to check out the first one first. And the Hurdy Gurdy was featured very prominently in the opening credits to Black Sails, and of course in the Witcher soundtracks as well. So this first articulation is just going to have the drone in the lower half of the range, and then the melody strings past C3. As you can hear, this has a really bold sound, so it's a great way to add an edgy, gritty vibe to something. And let's check out some of the other articulations. These are some tempo-synced repetitions, so this is going to be a great way to add some movement to something in a really creative and unique way. And the trumpet vibrato articulation is similar to the sustain, but I think it's got a little bit more color to it. It's great for lead lines. Now, the second Hurdy Gurdy is going to give you a bit of a different vibe from the first one. The drones have a slightly different timbre, and then the melody strings are actually playing in octaves. So here is what that sounds like. And I really like the vibrato sustains with this one as well. It sounds really intense because, again, those melody strings are playing in octaves. Such an incredible, unique vibe there. So let's shift gears a little bit and get into the orchestral string ensembles. Now, these were recorded in slightly smaller groups, so they're going to feel a bit more expressive and emotional, and these were really purpose-built for fantasy, and they really nail that feel. And the violins and violas and celli and basses were recorded in octaves. So we're going to start with the celli and basses. Next, let's check out the mod shorts. And this articulation actually contains 3 different lengths of shorts depending on your CC1 values that you have set. And usually CC1 is mapped to your mod wheel. And these are just so beautifully dark and punchy. And finally, we've got the violins and violas. And these were also recorded beautifully. Much like with the celli and the basses, they were recorded in octaves. So you can very quickly lay down a melody line, and it just absolutely soars without having to do any layering or other production techniques. So you have this beautiful definition of those slightly smaller ensembles, but the sound is still full and lush. So those are all of the instruments in Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra strings. Of course, we weren't able to hear all of the articulations, but the video would have been way too long and honestly kind of tedious if we had tried to do that. The idea here was to just give you a feel for what the library is all about, and hopefully we accomplished that. So now what I want to do is show you the scene that you saw at the very beginning of this video, but without any of the voiceover or sound design, so you can just hear the music by itself. And then we're going to break down the soundtrack and show you how Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra strings made it happen. So here it is. And we're starting with some tremolos in the high strings key switch patch. And I have the soft mood engaged for this. Even though it's the soft mood, I think it can make these tremolos in particular sound just a little bit darker, a little bit more mysterious even. And then these are being joined by the lutes and the dulcimers, and these are also playing a tremolo. So you just get this beautiful combination of textures, and it just makes this intro so dark and mysterious. And then you have this melody line coming in the high strings along with the viola da gamba. And they start off in unison, and then you can see where the viola da gamba actually breaks off right here. So let's go ahead and give it a listen from the top. Here it is. So you can hear how effectively those lute and dulcimer tremolos are creating this dark, kind of mysterious environment that everything else is then building on. Now, I should point out that while most of this piece is Hollywood Fantasy Orchestra strings, you are still going to be hearing some supporting elements from some of our future releases. I can't get too much into those, so consider this a bit of a teaser, but definitely stay tuned for those. Now, in this next section, you're kind of getting the backstory on how this goddess came to be. And so we needed something pretty ethereal, heavenly, but also just a little bit ominous. So you've got these notes hanging over in the Viola Da Gambas, and then you have the low strings coming in with this very simple sustain, and then this line in the Hardanger Fiddles. And when they come in, it just makes such a statement. It's a very stoic sound, and it was really ideal for a scene like this where you just kind of needed something otherworldly. So then you have the high strings coming in on this melody line, and they kind of transition us into this shot of the city. So let's go ahead and give it a listen, starting at measure 7. And this next scene is introducing the villain. So, of course, the music needs to turn quite a bit darker here. But at the beginning, it's a little bit more just mysterious and kind of ominous. And you just have this sustain in the high strings that's being held out from the phrase before. Of course, you have some tremolo lutes. And then in another high strings patch, you have this ascending line that is, of course, going to be complementing this descending line in the low strings. And then just kind of this random line that I played in the Viola da Gamba. I just played it in and then messed with some of the notes until it felt right. There's some dissonance there, so there's really no rhyme or reason to that. And then finally, you have this tremolo fifth in the Viola da Gambas. This is a really cool articulation, especially for crescendoing into a section, which is exactly how it's being used here. So let's go ahead and give this phrase a listen, and we'll start one beat out so that we can catch that note in the high strings and also get a little bit of that transition into this section. All right, now I actually want to solo a few things here because they just sound so good. It would be a shame if you couldn't hear them by themselves. So let's just hear what the low strings are doing. They just have such an incredible power to them, and they add such a beautiful darkness to this section. So here are just the low strings by themselves. They just sound great. And then you have the tremolo fifth in the Viola Da Gambas that I wanted to solo as well. They just have such a great intensity to them. Now, much of this next phrase is going to be more brass and vocal driven, of course, because this is the appearance of the dragon, but you still have a lot of string content here that's helping to drive this, most notably actually in the Hurdy Gurdy. So let's actually solo that. So that gritty texture was just absolutely ideal for the appearance of this villain. And then you have these really heavy bass stabs in the low strings. And then you also have this line in the high strings. So let's go ahead and hear it now with the rest of the elements. And this next section represents a turn in the story. So you've got this mage who's forging a sword that's calling forth the heroes from past ages to help fight this darkness. And so we needed something kind of cool and vibey here. So I opted to drive this section with the Lutes, the Dulcimers, and the Hardanger Fiddle spiccatos. So let's hear just these three elements by themselves. And you can hear how effective that is with just 3 tracks, and that's going to make a great foundation that we can then build all of the other elements on. And the melody here is being carried by the Viola Da Gamba and the Hardanger Fiddle, and they actually work pretty well with each other in octaves. So let's just hear them by themselves. They have such a great vibe for this section. And now let's go ahead and just hear everything together. So all we really needed here was a simple groove that kind of fit the mood and that also gave us a place to build from. Because there's so much going on visually and there's so much going on in the sound design, you don't want the music to compete with that, which is why it's relatively simple in this section. So let's go ahead and check out the last phrase. And this is pretty much the climax of the piece, but then at measure 30, you have this really vibey tag that's playing out while the book is closing, and you have that cool text reveal with those little shimmering sound effects. So here it is. And then let's actually hear that tag with the sound design, because that actually affected my musical choices in a fairly profound way here. It really suggested some textures that might not have been suggested if the sound design had been different. So here it is with those little shimmering sound effects.
Of stone, an elven blade master of the northern Sunderlands. And this is where your story begins.
And you can just hear how incredibly powerful the high strings are right here. There's emotion, there's power, the way it was played, the way it was recorded, just absolutely perfect in this context. And then with the sustains in the dulcimers against the tremolos in the lutes, you just get this really, really cool texture. And then in context.
And this is where your story begins.
So those two tracks are just doing a lot of work here, and they're really setting the tone for that entire end section. So I want to thank you so much for joining us on this epic adventure, and there are many more to come because we have many more releases planned in this series, and I am stoked out of my mind for these libraries. I've only had this one for a couple weeks now, and I already can't imagine working without it. It's really bleeding edge stuff, and in my mind now it's just essential. So if you're a Composer Cloud Plus subscriber, this library is now available to you. It's of course available as a standalone purchase as well, and if you liked this content, don't forget to like the video, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.